rain didn't just fall tonight. It lingered. It whispered against the pavement, against the glass, against the tired bones of a city that had seen better days. Inside the bar, the air smelled of old whiskey and quiet regrets. Dim lights hummed softly, reflecting in the half-cleaned bottles lined against the mirror. Behind the counter, the bartender wiped a glass for the third time. Not because it needed cleaning, but because his hands needed something to do. He looked exhausted. Not just physically, something deeper. Like a man who had spent too long fighting a war without knowing what he was fighting for. And across from him, sitting alone at the bar, was the old man. He wasn't dressed like a wise man. His coat was frayed, his boots stained with time. His face was carved with lines, the kind that come from too much thinking and not enough sleep. But his eyes were still sharp, like they had seen the end of the world and decided it wasn't worth fearing. He swirled his whiskey in the glass, watching the bartender with quiet amusement. Then he spoke.
You look tired, kid. Like the world chewed you up and forgot to spit you out.
The bartender barely glanced up, but something in the way the man said it made him pause.
Long day,
he muttered. The old man chuckled.
Nah, long life.
A silence stretched between them, heavy like the air before a storm. Outside, the rain picked up, tapping against the window like impatient fingers. Then, the old man leaned in, setting his drink down with a soft clink.
Let me guess,
he said.
You think you're stuck. You think this is all there is. You wake up, pour drinks for people who forget your name, go home, wake up, and do it again. And you're waiting for something to change.
The bartender frowned. Not because the man was wrong, but because he was too damn right. He didn't answer, so the old man did.
But nothing changes, kid. Not unless you do.
The bartender sighed, setting down the glass. His fingers lingered on the counter, the weight of exhaustion pressing into them.
Yeah,
he said, voice dry.
And what if I don't have it in me?
The old man smiled, but it wasn't kind, it wasn't gentle. It was the smile of someone who had seen people break and knew exactly how much they could take before they did.
Then you're already dead,
he said.
You just haven't realized it yet.
The bartender stopped breathing for half a second. Outside, the rain kept falling. Inside, something had just shifted, and for the first time in a long time, the bartender felt awake. Chapter 1. The weight of existence and the strength to carry it. The bartender stared at the old man. For a moment, the only sound between them was the soft patter of rain outside, the slow drip of water rolling down the window pane. The air smelled like damp leather and aged whiskey.
Then you're already dead,
the old man had said.
You just haven't realized it yet.
The words hung in the air, heavier than they should have been. The bartender exhaled through his nose, shaking his head.
That's a hell of a thing to say to a guy just trying to get through his shift.
The old man smirked.
You wanted small talk. You picked the wrong night.
The bartender picked up another glass, polishing it just to have something to do. The motions were automatic, like muscle memory, like habit, like someone running on fumes.
So what's the punchline?
He muttered.
I'm already dead. So what? What am I supposed to do with that?
The old man leaned back in his chair, rolling the last sip of whiskey across his tongue before answering.
That depends on you, kid. You got two choices. You can let it break you, or you can use it.
The bartender gave him a sideways glance.
Use what?
The old man tapped the counter, voice low and steady.
The weight of existence.
A pause.
Most people crumble under it. They spend their whole lives trying to run from it. Drugs, distractions, meaningless pleasures. Anything to avoid feeling how damn heavy it is to be alive.
The bartender's fingers stopped moving. His grip tightened slightly around the glass. The old man watched him closely. He sighed, then muttered.
Ever read Nietzsche?
The bartender scoffed.
Do I look like a philosophy major?
The old man chuckled.
Thought so. Well, listen to this.
He raised his glass slightly as if toasting something unseen.
To live is to suffer. To survive is to find some meaning in the suffering.
The bartender frowned.
So you're saying life's just pain, and we have to pretend it means something?
The old man shook his head.
No, I'm saying suffering is a given. But meaning, that's a choice.
The bartender fell silent. The old man continued.
You ever heard of Camus? The guy had a whole philosophy about this exact thing. The absurdity of life. The way everything feels pointless. And yet,
He tapped the counter again for emphasis.
he still said one thing that matters more than anything else.
He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice as if revealing a secret.
The struggle itself is enough to fill a man's heart. One must imagine Sisyphus happy.
The bartender's jaw clenched slightly.
So that's it? Just keep pushing the damn boulder up the hill and pretend it's enough?
The old man smirked.
No, you don't pretend. You accept it. You look at the weight on your shoulders. You acknowledge that it's heavy, and then you carry the damn thing anyway.
The bartender let out a slow breath. He didn't want to admit it, but something about those words made sense. The old man leaned back slightly, stretching his shoulders.
You want to know who else understood this better than most? He asked.
The bartender glanced up.
Viktor Frankl.
The name sounded vaguely familiar.
Psychiatrist, Holocaust survivor. Spent years in a concentration camp watching people break, watching people die. And yet, he wrote this.
The old man set his glass down.
When we are no longer able to change a situation, we are challenged to change ourselves. He lost everything. His family, his freedom. He saw death up close every single day. And yet, he found meaning in that suffering. Not because the suffering was good, but because he refused to let it break him.
The bartender swallowed.
And you think that applies to me?
The old man nodded.
You think you're suffering? You think life is unfair? Good. That means you're alive. Now, the question is, what are you going to do about it?
The bartender stared down at his hands. For the first time in weeks, they weren't shaking. Chapter 2. Suffering is the fuel of the will. The bartender was quiet. Outside, the rain tapped against the glass in slow, rhythmic pulses, the kind of sound that made the world feel heavier. Inside, the air smelled like whiskey, wet wood, and exhaustion. The old man took his time refilling his glass. His hands were steady, too steady, like a man who had seen storms worse than this and had learned not to flinch. The bartender finally spoke.
So, suffering, it's just inevitable.
The old man took a sip, then nodded.
It's not just inevitable, kid. It's necessary.
The bartender frowned.
That's a sick way of looking at things.
The old man smirked.
Maybe. But tell me something. Have you ever met a strong person who's had an easy life?
The bartender opened his mouth, then closed it, because he hadn't. The old man leaned forward slightly, elbows on the bar. His voice was lower now, measured.
Hemingway once wrote, "The world breaks everyone, and afterward, many are strong at the broken places."
The bartender exhaled through his nose.
And what about the people who don't get strong?
The old man tilted his glass toward him.
Then, the world keeps breaking them until there's nothing left. That's the truth no one likes to talk about.
The bartender didn't answer, because deep down, he knew the old man was right. He had seen it before, people who couldn't handle the weight, People who let the world grind them down until they were nothing but ghosts walking through their own lives. And he had felt it himself.
Ever hear of the Agoge?
The old man asked. The bartender shook his head.
It was the training system in ancient Sparta. They didn't just teach boys how to fight. They taught them how to suffer.
The old man set his glass down gently, like he was placing a heavy truth between them.
They starved them, beat them, threw them into the wilderness with nothing but their instincts. They wanted to see if a boy would cry about it, or if he would stand up and fight anyway.
The bartender swallowed.
And the ones who didn't make it?
The old man shrugged.
They didn't make it.
The bartender looked away.
That's brutal.
The old man nodded.
Yeah. And you know what's even worse? Life does the same thing. The only difference is, life doesn't give you a training manual.
The bartender ran a hand through his hair, letting out a slow breath. The old man tapped the counter once, the sound sharp and deliberate.
Every time you suffer, you have a choice. You can let it break you, or you can let it sharpen you.
The bartender's jaw tightened.
Nietzsche had another one for this. That which does not kill us makes us stronger.
The bartender scoffed.
Sounds like something people say to make themselves feel better.
The old man chuckled.
Maybe. But here's the thing.
He pointed at the bartender.
Every strong person you've ever admired, every warrior, every survivor, every damn legend in history, they all had one thing in common.
The bartender raised an eyebrow.
And what's that?
The old man drained the last of his drink, set the glass down, and grinned.
They suffered, but they kept going anyway. You ever read about Teddy Roosevelt?
The old man asked. The bartender shook his head.
Kid was sickly. Asthma so bad he could barely breathe as a child. His own father told him, "You have the mind, but not the body. And without the body, the mind cannot go as far as it should."
The bartender raised an eyebrow.
Damn.
Yeah,
The old man continued.
but you know what Roosevelt did? He didn't accept it. He trained his body, boxed, hunted, built himself from the ground up. He went from a frail kid to a war hero, a rough rider, a president who took a damn bullet to the chest during a speech and kept talking.
The bartender leaned in slightly.
The bullet was still inside him, but he finished his speech. You know what he said?
The old man's eyes gleamed as he recited it.
It takes more than that to kill a bull moose.
The bartender exhaled.
That's insane.
The old man nodded.
Yeah, but that's willpower, kid. That's what it looks like in the real world.
The bartender stared at the whiskey bottle, deep in thought.
So what? You're saying I should be happy that life sucks?
The old man smirked.
Number. I'm saying you should use it. Every time you get knocked down, every time you suffer, every time life kicks you in the teeth, you take that pain, and you sharpen yourself with it.
He tapped the counter again, softer this time.
You survive long enough, kid, and one day you'll realize suffering isn't an obstacle.
He lifted his glass, swirling the last drops of whiskey.
It's the path.
Chapter 3. The Illusion of Control and the Power of Acceptance. The bartender poured himself a drink. It was against the rules. He knew that. But tonight, the rules felt like an afterthought. The old man had been peeling away something in him, like stripping varnish off old wood. Each word, each story, each damn quote was making it harder to ignore the weight in his chest. He took a slow sip. The burn of the whiskey wasn't as sharp as he expected.
So what's next?
Now we talk about control.
The old man smirked.
You got the wrong guy for that. Feels like I've never had control over anything in my life.
The old man tilted his head.
Good. That means you're finally seeing the truth.
The truth?
The old man swirled his whiskey. The dim bar lights reflected in the amber liquid.
Control is an illusion, kid. The sooner you accept that, the freer you'll be.
The bartender stared at him.
That's supposed to be motivational.
More than you think.
The old man tapped the counter.
Marcus Aurelius. Ever heard of him?
Some Roman emperor, right?
The old man nodded.
The last great emperor of Rome. Spent his whole life surrounded by war, betrayal, and plague. And you know what he said?
He took a slow sip, then set his glass down gently.
You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength.
The bartender exhaled.
So what? I'm just supposed to let life happen and not care?
Not at all. You're supposed to focus on what you can control. Your thoughts, your actions, your reactions. Everything else, that's just noise.
The bartender swirled his drink, watching the liquid catch the light.
Easier said than done.
The old man chuckled.
Of course it is. But that doesn't make it any less true. You think it's hard to accept that you're not in control?
The old man asked.
Try being tortured for 7 years.
The bartender blinked.
What?
The old man leaned in slightly.
James Stockdale, U.S. Navy pilot, shot down over Vietnam, captured, and thrown into a POW camp. 7 years of beatings, starvation, and psychological torture. They tried to break him, and yet he survived.
The bartender's grip tightened around his glass.
How?
Because he followed the same philosophy I just told you. He focused only on what he could control. His mind, his will. They could break his body, but not his thoughts. And he had a phrase he lived by. Something from the Stoics.
He let the silence stretch before speaking.
I never lost faith in the end of the story.
The bartender swallowed.
7 years.
He muttered.
7 years.
And he made it.
The old man nodded.
Because he accepted that he wasn't in control of the pain, only how he faced it.
The bartender set his drink down.
So, what am I supposed to do with that?
The old man smiled.
Stop fighting the things you can't change. Stop wasting energy on battles that aren't yours to fight. Life's gonna throw storms at you. You don't get a say in that, but you do get a say in how you walk through them.
He gestured toward the window. Outside, the rain was still falling, steady and relentless.
Most people spend their lives cursing the rain. But the smart ones,
He took one last sip of whiskey.
they learn how to walk in it.
Chapter 4. The Fire That Keeps You Alive. Why Discomfort is Necessary for Growth. The bartender rolled the glass between his fingers, staring at the whiskey inside. The rain outside hadn't let up. If anything, it had gotten stronger. Heavy drops rattled against the windows, pooling on the empty streets.
All right.
He muttered.
So I can't control the storm. Fine. But what if I don't want to walk through it? What if I just sit here and wait it out?
The old man smirked.
Then you'll rot, kid.
The bartender looked up.
Excuse me?
The old man leaned in slightly, voice quiet but firm. You ever leave food out too long? Watch it sit? What happens?
The bartender frowned.
It rots.
The old man nodded.
Exactly. And people aren't much different. You sit too long, you stay too comfortable, and you decay.
The bartender exhaled, rubbing his temples.
So you're saying I have to suffer?
The old man chuckled.
I'm saying you already are. The only question is, do you let that suffering shape you, or do you let it eat you alive?
The bartender's expression stayed skeptical.
You ever hear about Misogi?
The old man asked. The bartender shook his head.
It's an old Japanese purification ritual. But the idea behind it? That's where it gets interesting.
The old man took another sip of whiskey, then continued.
The belief is that if you want to grow, if you want to truly wake up, you have to push yourself beyond what you think you can handle. Cold rivers, harsh conditions, extreme endurance. They do it to remind themselves what they're capable of.
The bartender raised an eyebrow.
And what if they can't handle it?
The old man smiled.
Then they learn something even more valuable.
The bartender waited.
They learn where their limits actually are.
The bartender let out a breath.
So you're saying pain is the only way to grow?
The old man tilted his head.
Pain isn't the point. Discomfort is. The problem is, most people think they're the same thing.
The bartender frowned.
What's the difference?
The old man tapped the counter.
Pain weakens you. But discomfort, that's just pressure. And pressure is how you make something great.
He smirked.
You know Michelangelo hated painting the Sistine Chapel?
The bartender blinked.
Yeah.
The old man nodded.
Yeah. The Pope forced him into it. Michelangelo saw himself as a sculptor, not a painter. The guy didn't even want the job, but he was pushed and pushed and pushed, until he created one of the greatest works of art in history.
The bartender shook his head.
So he was miserable the whole time?
The old man grinned.
That's the funny part. At first, yeah. But by the end, he was obsessed. He stopped sleeping, stopped eating, worked for years until it was perfect. Because discomfort does something to a man, kid.
He gestured at the bartender's drink.
It burns, doesn't it?
The bartender nodded.
But that burn is what wakes you up.
Without the fire, you fade away. The bartender let the old man's words sink in. He thought about his own life. The way he had let himself settle. How he had spent years avoiding risk, avoiding pain, avoiding discomfort. And where had that gotten him? Here, stuck in the same place, pouring drinks, waiting for something, anything, to change. But nothing would. Not unless he let himself step into the fire. Not unless he let it shape him instead of burn him. The old man set his empty glass down.
You don't have to like the fire, kid. You just have to learn how to stand in it.
The bartender looked out at the rain again, and for the first time in a long time, he thought about stepping outside. Chapter 5. The Strength to Act. Why Thinking is Not Enough. The bartender didn't say anything at first. He just picked up the whiskey bottle, tilted it, and poured another drink for the old man. The liquid splashed against the glass, smooth and steady. No hesitation this time. No mindless polishing of empty cups. It was a small thing, a simple motion. But the old man noticed.
So, you're still listening?
The bartender shrugged.
You're still talking.
The old man chuckled, lifting his glass in a quiet toast before taking a slow sip. The bartender leaned against the counter, staring out at the rain.
All right.
He muttered.
I get it. Suffering sharpens you. Control is an illusion. Discomfort is necessary. Fine.
He turned back to the old man, his gaze more focused now.
But what the hell am I supposed to do with that?
The old man smirked.
Now, kid. Now you act.
The old man set his glass down, tapping the counter with his fingers.
You ever hear of Søren Kierkegaard?
The bartender narrowed his eyes.
Philosopher.
The old man nodded.
The guy spent his whole life thinking, analyzing, writing. And you know what he figured out?
The bartender shrugged.
That most people never actually live. They just think about living.
The old man leaned in slightly.
Action expresses priorities. You can read every book in the world. You can study philosophy, analyze suffering, learn about willpower. But until you get up and do something, none of it matters.
The bartender exhaled through his nose.
So you're saying I've been wasting my time thinking?
The old man shook his head.
No, thinking is fine. But if you stop there, you become like all the other lost souls out there, paralyzed by ideas, drowning in theories, waiting for some perfect moment to act that will never come. You ever read about Napoleon?
The old man asked.
The French guy?
Yeah, the French guy. You know how he won battles? He didn't sit around analyzing every single possible move. He moved first. He made decisions while everyone else was still debating. He said, if you start to take Vienna, take Vienna.
The old man tapped his glass lightly, voice steady.
Take time to deliberate. But when the time for action comes, stop thinking and go in.
The bartender thought about that. How many nights had he spent sitting in this bar, thinking, wishing things were different, waiting for some moment of clarity that never came? The old man must have seen the thought flicker across his face.
You want to change your life, kid?
He said. The bartender swallowed.
Then stop waiting. Start moving.
The bartender rubbed the back of his neck, exhaling.
And what if I fail?
The old man chuckled.
Oh, you will. Probably a lot.
The bartender frowned.
That's not very comforting.
The old man grinned.
It should be. Because failure means you're in the fight. You're alive. And that's more than most people can say.
He leaned back in his chair, letting the rain outside fill the silence.
You think warriors weren't afraid before battle? You think philosophers didn't doubt their own ideas? Fear isn't the enemy, kid. Stagnation is.
The bartender nodded slowly. The old man picked up his glass again.
You poured me another drink. That means you want to keep going. So now I'll ask you, are you finally ready to act?
The bartender looked down at his hands. Then, without a word, he set his glass down and reached for the bottle again. And this time, he poured one for himself. Chapter 6. The Leap into the Unknown. Why risk is the price of freedom. The bartender sat in silence for a moment. The glass in his hand felt heavier than before. Maybe it was the weight of the conversation. Maybe it was something else. The rain outside hadn't stopped. But inside, something had shifted.
All right,
He muttered.
I get it. Action matters. Thinking isn't enough. But what if I make the wrong move? What if I take a risk and everything falls apart?
The old man smirked.
Then you'll finally know what it means to be alive.
The bartender scoffed.
Sounds like a pretty stupid way to live.
The old man raised an eyebrow.
Is it? Or is it the only way to live at all? Fortune favors the bold, but most people never try.
The old man tapped his fingers against the counter, his rhythm slow and deliberate.
Julius Caesar had a moment, you know. A single moment where he had to decide. Step forward or stay safe.
Yeah? And what was that?
The old man leaned in slightly, lowering his voice like he was sharing a secret.
Crossing the Rubicon.
What's that?
It was a river. More importantly, it was a line he wasn't supposed to cross. See, back in ancient Rome, A general wasn't allowed to bring his army into Italy. The moment he did, he was declaring war against the Republic itself.
The bartender nodded slowly.
And Caesar did it anyway.
The old man smirked.
Damn right he did. He stood at the edge of that river, knowing if he stepped forward, there was no going back. You know what he said?
He lifted his glass slightly.
Alea iacta est. The die is cast.
The bartender exhaled.
So he bet everything on one move.
Not just a move, a decision, a commitment. He knew hesitation was death, so he stepped forward. And that step changed history.
The bartender rolled his glass between his fingers.
But not everyone's trying to conquer Rome,
He muttered. The old man chuckled.
You don't have to be. But the rule's the same, whether you're leading an army or trying to change your life. If you don't take risks, you stay exactly where you are.
He gestured around the bar.
You want to know why most people never get anywhere? Why they rot in the same dead-end jobs, the same routines, the same empty existence?
The bartender waited.
Because they're too afraid to fail.
The bartender clenched his jaw. The old man watched him carefully.
Let me tell you something, kid. Safety is a lie. There's no such thing as a life without risk. The only difference is whether you choose your risk or let the world choose it for you.
The bartender took a slow sip of his drink, letting the warmth settle in his chest.
And what if I make the wrong choice?
The old man smirked.
Then you adapt, you learn, you take another step. You ever hear about the Wright brothers?
The old man asked. The bartender scoffed.
Everyone has. They invented the airplane.
The old man nodded.
Yeah. But you know how many times they crashed before they got it right?
The bartender shrugged.
Hundreds. And every time, they picked up the wreckage, figured out what went wrong, and tried again. And people laughed at them, called them lunatics. Man wasn't meant to fly, they said. But the Wright brothers knew something most people don't.
He tapped the counter lightly.
If we worked on the assumption that what is accepted as true is really true, then there would be little hope for advance. They weren't afraid to crash because they knew the only way to fly was to risk falling.
The bartender exhaled, staring into his glass.
So you're saying failure is part of it?
The old man nodded.
Not just part of it, the cost of admission.
The bartender took a slow, measured breath. For years, he had played it safe, stuck to the rules, avoided risk, avoided failure, avoided anything that could make life harder. And where had that gotten him? Here, pouring drinks in a bar he didn't care about, waiting for a life he wasn't brave enough to reach for. The old man finished his drink, set the empty glass down.
You got a choice, kid. You can stay behind the bar, polishing glasses, waiting for life to come to you.
He pushed the glass forward slightly.
Or you can take a step forward and see what happens.
The bartender didn't answer right away. Instead, he picked up the whiskey bottle, tilted it, and poured another drink. But this time, not just for the old man, for himself. Chapter 7. Overcoming Fear, the courage to step into the unknown. The bartender set his drink down. For the first time since the conversation started, he leaned forward, not out of obligation, not because it was his job to listen, but because he wanted to know more.
All right,
He said, tilting his head slightly.
you keep talking about risk, about acting. But what about fear?
The old man smiled.
Ah, so now you're asking the right questions.
What, everything else was the wrong question?
Ah, not wrong, just incomplete. See, action isn't just about making a move. It's about making a move despite fear.
He lifted his glass, turning it slowly in his hand.
Most people think courage is the absence of fear. It's not. Courage is being afraid and doing it anyway.
And how the hell do you do that?
By understanding fear for what it is. A test.
The bartender squinted slightly.
You talk like a guy who's been tested before.
The old man's smile didn't fade, but for the first time, there was something else behind it. Something heavier.
Maybe I have.
The bartender waited. For a second, he thought the old man might actually say more, but the silence stretched, and the moment passed.
But this isn't about me, kid. It's about you.
The old man took a slow sip of his drink, then set it down carefully.
You ever been in a situation where your whole body locked up? Your hands shook? Your breathing got tight, like something was pulling you back?
The bartender nodded.
Yeah.
That's fear. And fear is a wall. It keeps most people trapped. Keeps them safe. But it also keeps them small.
He leaned in slightly.
You know who figured that out.
The bartender shook his head.
Seneca, a Roman Stoic, lived through exile, political turmoil, betrayals. And yet, he wrote this.
He tapped the counter for emphasis.
We suffer more in imagination than in reality.
The bartender exhaled.
So fear isn't real.
Oh, it's real. But the worst part of it? The worst part exists only in your head. You play out every terrible possibility before it happens. You convince yourself the fall is worse than it actually is.
The bartender was quiet, because he had done exactly that, too many times to count.
Want to hear a story?
The old man asked, and the bartender gave him a look.
Do I have a choice?
Not really.
He lifted his glass slightly.
Teddy Roosevelt. You remember how I told you he was built by suffering? Well, let me tell you about the time fear almost killed him.
The bartender narrowed his eyes.
Go on.
It was the night of an assassination attempt. Some lunatic shot him. The bullet went through his coat, through his speech notes, and lodged itself in his chest. And do you know what he did?
The bartender shook his head.
He stood up, looked at the crowd, and said, "It takes more than that to kill a bull moose." Then he finished his speech, with a bullet in his damn chest.
The bartender blinked.
No way.
The old man grinned.
Courage, hard work, self-mastery, and intelligent effort are all essential to a successful life. You think Roosevelt wasn't afraid? You think when that bullet hit him, he wasn't feeling that cold grip of fear?
The bartender swallowed.
So why didn't he stop?
The old man's smile faded slightly.
Because he understood something most people don't. Fear isn't a stop sign. It's just a signal, a challenge. And the ones who push through it, those are the ones who build something real. The only way past fear is through it.
The bartender tapped his fingers against the counter, deep in thought.
So the trick is just not caring?
The old man shook his head.
No, kid. The trick is caring enough to do it anyway. Fear will never go away. It's always there, whispering in the back of your head, telling you to stay put, telling you to wait, telling you it's too dangerous.
He leaned in slightly.
But if you listen to it too long, you'll spend your whole life sitting behind this bar, waiting for something that never comes.
The bartender's grip tightened around his glass. The old man watched him for a long moment. Then, for the first time, he sighed.
You asked about me earlier.
The bartender looked up. The old man stared at his whiskey, swirling it slowly.
I had a choice once, a long time ago, and I almost didn't take it. almost let fear stop me. And if I had, well, let's just say I wouldn't be sitting here right now, drinking this whiskey, talking to you.
The bartender opened his mouth, but the old man shook his head.
That's all you're getting, kid. Some things are better left in the past.
The bartender smirked slightly.
So you do have a story.
The old man chuckled.
Everyone does.
The bartender stared at him for a long moment. Then slowly, he picked up the whiskey bottle, tilted it, poured another drink for the old man.
All right,
He said quietly.
keep going.
The old man smiled.
I thought you'd never ask.
Chapter 8. The meaning of the human will, choosing to stand up. The bartender stared at the old man. For the first time all night, the air between them was still. The rain outside had softened. Not gone, but gentler now. No longer hammering the windows, no longer demanding attention. Just a whisper against the glass. A sound that, if you listened closely, almost felt like breathing. The bartender let out a slow, measured breath. A strange feeling stirred in his chest. Something he couldn't quite name. Not relief, not clarity, but something close. A pull. A shift. A flicker of something he wasn't sure he believed in anymore. He shifted his weight, rubbed a hand over his face. His mind felt thick, full of thoughts that had no shape, no structure. Just a tangled mess of feelings and questions, all pressing against each other, all demanding to be acknowledged at once. How long had he been ignoring this? How long had he been drowning it out with the easy comfort of routine, of distraction, of letting life happen to him instead of choosing to live it? His voice, when he finally spoke, felt smaller than he expected.
So that's it. The great secret to life? Just keep moving?
The old man smirked, but it wasn't condescending. It was something else. Like he had seen this moment before. Like he had been here. Like he knew exactly what was happening inside the bartender's head.
You say that like it's easy.
The bartender scoffed. A short, breathy sound, half amusement, half exhaustion.
It's not
No, it's not.
The old man agreed, lifting his glass, staring into the amber liquid. He swirled it absently, watching the way the liquid caught the dim light.
But it's simple.
The bartender exhaled slowly. His fingers drummed against the counter, restless, thoughtful. That answer bothered him, not because he didn't believe it, but because deep down, he did believe it. And that meant something he didn't want to admit. It meant that all the years he had spent waiting for a sign, for motivation, for something to push him forward, had been wasted. Because it was never about waiting. It was always about choosing, and he hadn't. His throat felt dry. He swallowed, then muttered.
And what if I screw up? What if I make the wrong choice?
The old man chuckled, quiet, knowing.
Then you stand up, dust yourself off, and try again.
Try again. The bartender's jaw tightened. He hated that answer, not because it was wrong, but because it was right. He had spent years trapped in his own mind, convincing himself that his failures defined him. That one bad decision, one misstep, was enough to derail everything. But what if that wasn't true? What if he had been the one keeping himself down all along? What if the only thing standing between him and the life he wanted was his own fear of making the wrong choice? He exhaled through his nose, looking down at his hands.
You make it sound like we don't have a choice.
The old man's expression changed just slightly, just enough to make the bartender pause.
Oh, you always have a choice, kid. That's the whole point.
The words hit him like a weight on his chest, because if he always had a choice, then that meant this was his fault. The nights of waiting, the opportunities missed, the things he had told himself weren't possible. He had let himself believe he was trapped. He had chosen them. The realization wasn't comforting, but it was freeing. The old man took a slow sip of his drink, then set the glass down.
That's what will is.
The bartender let out a slow breath.
Sounds nice.
He muttered.
But willpower doesn't change reality.
The old man tilted his head slightly.
No?
A smirk, a quiet clink as he set his glass down.
You ever hear of Nelson Mandela?
The bartender nodded.
Spent 27 years in prison. And yet, when they let him out, he didn't come out bitter. He came out stronger. He had no power, no army, no wealth, just one thing.
The bartender raised an eyebrow.
What?
The old man's smile was faint but knowing.
His will.
He gestured lightly.
I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul.
The bartender closed his eyes for a second, letting the words sink in. The man had everything taken from him, and yet he still chose who he was going to be. A choice. Always a choice. The old man tapped the counter once, voice steady.
Everything in life can be taken from you. Your money, your job, your health, even your freedom. But the one thing no one can ever take.
He held up a single finger, a slow, deliberate motion.
Your will.
The bartender's chest tightened. That word, will. It wasn't something he had thought much about. He thought about circumstances, about luck, about talent, about fate. But will, he had never thought of it as something separate from everything else, as something untouchable, unbreakable.
The last thing you own, the old man continued. The last line of defense. And if you hold on to it, if you refuse to let go,
a small smirk. Then you win. The bartender swallowed. His heart was beating harder now. A quiet, steady drum against his ribs.
Win what?
His voice was hoarse. The old man raised an eyebrow.
Yourself.
The bartender felt something sharp lodge itself in his throat. Yourself. When was the last time he had really felt like himself? When was the last time he had made a choice? Not out of obligation, not out of fear, but because it was what he truly wanted. Most people go through life never realizing that's the real battle. The bartender knew that battle well. He had fought it in silence for years, and he was tired of losing. The old man leaned forward slightly, resting his arms on the bar.
What are you gonna do?
The bartender hesitated. For a long time, he had been waiting for a sign, waiting for motivation. But that wasn't how it worked, was it? There was no perfect moment, no grand revelation, just a choice, and either he made it or he didn't. The bartender exhaled.
I don't know yet.
The old man smirked.
That's a better answer than you think.
The bartender rolled his eyes.
You always this cryptic.
Only when I drink too much whiskey.
The bartender chuckled. Then, after a moment, he looked at the old man.
You got a name?
The old man smiled.
I'm just an old man who drinks too much whiskey.
The bartender smirked. Fine, let the old man keep his mystery. The old man finished his drink, set the glass down, then stood up.
I should be going.
The bartender frowned slightly.
You sure? You've got a little left in your glass.
The old man glanced down.
Yeah, well, maybe I'll leave this one unfinished.
The door swung shut behind him with a soft click. The bartender stared at it for a long moment. Then, slowly, he looked down at his hands. They weren't shaking anymore. Something had changed. He wasn't sure what. Not exactly, but there was something inside him now. A shift, a flicker of something beneath the surface. Hope, resolve, it didn't matter, because whatever it was enough. At least for now. But it was something, And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. For now.